Hey, I'm Steve Lehto, and I've written a few books, and I often mention that at the top end of my podcast and my videos. And today we're going to talk about a book that I have read recently and became very concerned about after it came out called Grown Up Anger: The Connected Mysteries of Bob Dylan, Woody Guthrie, and the Calumet Massacre of 1913. And, I've written a variety of books on a variety of topics, but one of the first books that ever got published was called Death's Door: The Truth Behind Michigan's Largest Mass Murder. It came out in 2006, and it was all about the Italian Hall disaster. And in the 12 years since that book came out, I've written several other books on the topic. I've written magazine articles. I've been consulted by people on documentaries. I've appeared in documentaries. And so anytime anything comes out that's related to the Italian Hall disaster, number one, people tell me about it. But then number two, I will follow up and say, I'll read it to see what's in there. And when I'd heard that Daniel Wolfe had written this book, I looked him up, and he's a music writer. And he says it's the connected mysteries of Bob Dylan, Woody Guthrie, and the Calumet Massacre. And Woody Guthrie wrote a song called 1913 Massacre about the Italian Hall disaster. And I knew that, and so I suspected that was the thread through this whole story. So in case you're wondering, the Italian Hall disaster was something that happened in 1913. There was a miners' strike in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan's Copper Country. And up there during the strike, they held a party for the children of the striking miners. And during that party, someone ran into the hall, at the Italian Hall where this party is being held, and yelled fire to break the party up. And during that stampede that followed to get out of the building, 73 people died. 60 of them were children at least. And the death toll 73. And no one was ever arrested for it. So that was pretty much the focus of my book. How does something like that happen, where someone can run into a hall, yell fire, kill 73 people, and get away with it? And then also, how do we get to a point as a society where someone will even do that in the first place? So I wrote my book in 2006. I also wrote a follow-up book to it, a second edition, which added much more information I discovered in years afterwards, after that book was published. And so when Grown Up Anger came out, before I even got a chance to see the book, I sent an email to Daniel Wolfe, the author, and I asked him if he was aware of my work, because I just assumed he probably would be if he'd done any research on the topic. And he said that he had seen my work, and he said yes, it was actually very important to my research, and so I hope you enjoy the book. So I went out and got a copy of the book, and I'll tell you right now, the book promises that Wolfe traces a century-long line of anger. The battle over economic justice keeps resurfacing in the story, and the book chronicles the struggles between the haves and the have-nots, and the way two musicians use their fury to illuminate injustice. So Wolfe appears to be at least saying that he's going to be pro-worker in the story. And as you may have guessed, when I mentioned that this happened during a miners' strike, there was a lot of fighting going on between mine management and the workers, or the strikers. And so a lot of people view this as a class struggle. They view it as a fight between these two different groups. And obviously that fight is very relevant today with respect to the unions and the management of corporations and so on. And so when I read that back matter that says that he's going to be talking about this, in essence, from the workers' viewpoint, I thought, well, that's good, because that's the angle I took it from as well. I think that if you examine the story of the Italian Hall disaster and look at all the evidence, you come away with profound belief that the workers got the short end of it in this one, and not just in the fact that 73 people died, but it's a horrible story. But you really have to look at it from the workers' viewpoint, because they were the ones affected by it the most. And so I was interested to read his book when I got it. And when I got his book, I was kind of surprised and disappointed, because even though the book itself says it's going to be pro-worker, the book's not. And I want to make sure this is very, very clear. So I actually typed this up and wrote it out to make sure I get this clear. I don't want anybody misunderstanding what I'm talking about when I'm critiquing Grown Up Anger. Wolfe, I believe, intended to tell the story of the tragedy in a way that accurately reflected the sufferings and wrongs done to the workers. But his failure to think critically or examine critically the major points in the narrative really hurt that purpose. And he actually does a disservice to those who died and their families, friends, and community. So I'm going to give you some examples of mistakes in Wolfe's book. And here's the thing. If you get something wrong, it can be a mistake. If someone points it out to you and you still do it, is it still a mistake? Because what happened was, when I got his book originally, it came out hardcover. That's this one right here. And I got the hardcover of the book, and I read it, and I was disappointed in many of the ways he presented the facts of the story. So I wrote an email to him and said, Daniel, I've read your book. He cited me 40 times, 40 times he cited me in his endnotes, and I said, I'm disappointed. There's a lot of mistakes in your book, and I don't see how these mistakes got in there if you actually did the research on this. And he said, well, I read your book. And by the way, the first time I asked him, which book of mine did you read, he wasn't sure. He read the first edition of my book, but not the second. And the second edition of the book had been out for a few years already. So I'm not sure why he didn't bother reading the second edition, because the second edition answers more clearly some of the problems that he had in his book. But be that as it may, I sent him a note, and so he actually emailed me and said, Steve, in preparation for paperback of Grown Up Anger, wanted to check in with you. I know there were corrections you had to some of my facts. Would like to fix them. Let me know any suggestions you have. And again, thanks for all your good and groundbreaking work, Daniel Wolf. So I sent him an email that's 2 or 3 pages long with page numbers and explanations of what he'd gotten wrong and how he could fix it. And here's the important thing. He responded back to me and said, many thanks. I will pore over this and try to change what I can. Again, thanks for your exhaustive and important work. But here's the thing. In my email to him, not only did I say, here are the things you got wrong, I made him an offer. I said, as a preliminary note, I would like to note that I have hard copies of many of the primary materials relevant here. If you have not seen them or do not have good copies, let me know. I have the death certificates, all, a clean copy of the coroner's transcript, a copy of the RFJD log entry, and so on. So I'm a historian. I'm a writer, I'm a lawyer, but I'm also a historian. And historians don't make up stuff. We don't write fiction. I go and look at evidence, primary materials, and look at that and see what it tells us. And then we interpret that, we write about it. And so when I write my book and I say, 73 people died at the Italian Hall, I'll give you a citation and you can go look it up and say, where did you get that from? And I'll actually have a place where I'll say, here's where I got that from. Here's my source. So I offered to give Mr. Wolf all of my materials to back up every single claim I made if he doubted any of them. He didn't respond to that in any meaningful way, but the paperback just came out and I got a copy of it and I flipped through it and I realized he's made almost no changes. He made 1 or 2 superficial changes, but he left things intact that are wrong. And not only are they wrong, but they're wrong in a way that makes the workers look bad. So in other words, his promise, at least the publisher's promise on the back cover, that says things about, this is a chronicle, the struggles between the haves and the have-nots. And he talks about the way 2 musicians use their fury to illuminate injustice. Well, then why does Mr. Wolf make mistakes that go against the worker's position? I mean, just go with the facts. Instead, he twists the facts the other direction. So this is the problem I have with Mr. Wolf, and I'm going to talk to you about some of them, and I'm going to point out to you the mistakes he made and why they're important and why they actually hurt his proposed concept that he was going to come out and tell the story of Woody Guthrie, Bob Dylan, this song, and this injustice issue. So for instance, when the workers went on strike, they sent a letter to mine management, and they said, in essence, we want to meet with you to discuss some things. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to talk about wages, hours, and working conditions. Those are the 3 things that are listed in their letter. And I actually published the letter verbatim in my book, the full letter, word for word. So in Grown Up Anger, Daniel Wolf says that the letter outlined their demands, including a ban on the one-man drill. It's not true. They didn't mention the one-man drill. And the one-man drill was a device that the mines were starting to incorporate around 1912, 1913. And obviously the one-man drill used 1 less person to operate it than the 2-man drill. And so there was some concern that the one-man drill was going to cause a change in how many people were employed underground and so on. But the one-man drill was not mentioned in the letter to mine management. And so when Daniel Wolf says that The letter outlined their demands, including a ban on the one-man drill. He's saying something that's not even true, first of all. And second of all, he's making the strikers look like Luddites. They're scared of technology. They're backwards. They're trying to hold back management. They don't like the fact that management can make money or do things efficiently. But why did he put that there? Why would he put something there that's not there? And the only possible reason for putting it there is either just being extremely sloppy, or he's actually trying to undermine the case of the workers. So, I'll leave that to you to decide, but the point is that he gets that horribly, horribly wrong. Page 156, he mentions that a shootout occurred when someone tried to bring a striker in for questioning. And the phrase, to bring someone in for questioning, implies that it's a police action. Police go to your house, they grab somebody, they bring somebody in for questioning. And in fact, the person who got shot that he's referring to was shot by some rogue mine workers who are not on strike. They were not police officers. They weren't authorized to do anything, and they weren't even asked to go to that house by the police. Mine management sent these guys to this house, and they shot the house up and killed 2 people. And in fact, the shooters were later put on trial for murder. Okay? So to suggest that, oh no, it was simply some guy was being brought in for questioning and a fight broke out. He has adopted the version of the story that was told by the anti-worker historians in this field. And that's one of the problems that I have a problem with Mr. Wolf's book, is he cites a bunch of sources in the back, books he read and books that he relied upon, including mine 40 times in the endnotes. And some of the books he cites aren't good histories. And I told him that in my emails. By the way, one of the books you cite repeatedly has been basically debunked by historians who've gone through it. I went through the one particular book, not Mr. Wolf's, but the book he relies upon, every single endnote to see if any of it matched up, and it turns out that the guy was making stuff up. And I actually corresponded with that author and said, I found mistakes in your endnotes where you cite something and you say that you can find it here and it's not there. And that author, who's now passed away, wrote back to me and said, something, I may have made some mistakes. I didn't take very good notes. And so he admitted to me that he was basically just making stuff up and sticking in endnotes to make it look good. But to rely on that book over a book like mine or a book like others in the field is a very serious problem for a historian. But that's one of the problems I have in Mr. Wolf's book, is that he treats all sources as equal. And I realize that if you watch too much of the modern news today, if you find somebody who's going to talk about the solar eclipse, you find somebody who doesn't believe in solar eclipses, and you put them both on it and let them both give their viewpoints. And that's fine in the news if you want to always have somebody showing the other side, but there are some things for which there are not two sides, okay? 2 + 2 = 4. I would not now bring out someone who's going to go, oh, and here's the counter position, 2 + 2 might equal 5. You wouldn't do that, okay? So there's no need to raise arguments where facts are settled. And they didn't go to that house to bring the men in for questioning. They shot the men in broad daylight with no justifiable excuse, which explains why they were later convicted of, killing those guys. One of the biggest problems I have with this book, Grown Up Anger, is something that Daniel Wolf appears to have done on his own. There's a famous photograph of the interior of the Italian Hall. In fact, I'm going to pause for a split second so I can put it up on the screen. And that photograph shows chairs knocked around and in disarray towards the camera away from the main stage. And the chairs at the front of the hall nearest to the stage are all neatly lined up. And Daniel Wolf writes in his book that the cry of fire was not heard very far from the doors because the chairs near the stage aren't knocked over. And that's something that he simply deduced on his own after looking at the photograph, because that's who he cites. He actually cites the photograph, implying, I looked at it, that's what I saw. If Daniel Wolf had actually investigated that topic a little more carefully, he would have discovered that the chairs nearest to the stage were bolted to the floor. They were auditorium seats. The chairs in the back were folding chairs. One of the reasons I know this is I have one of the chairs right here. This is one of the folding chairs from the Italian Hall. This chair was there the night of the disaster. It was one of the folding chairs in the back of the hall. The chairs at the front were bolted to the floor. So to suggest that because the chairs at the front weren't knocked over, there must not have been that much of a tumultuous situation, Mr. Wolf is simply wrong. And again, why is he downplaying the cry of fire if he's writing a pro-worker piece? Well, again, that's for you to decide. Other issues I had with his book, and I'm going to tell you right now, I sent him 3 pages of stuff. I deleted a bunch of them for the purposes of our discussion here, simply because I don't have much time. He repeatedly says that 74 people died. 73 people died. And you might say, Steve, at least he's exaggerating it in the correct direction, right? Well, here's a problem, though. The 74 number comes from bad histories. There have been some, I mentioned before, other histories written in this field, some of which are simply incorrect. And some of them adopt the number 74. But the correct number is 73. And I offered to send Mr. Wolf a copy of each and every death certificate we have from the hall. And I've got photographs of the book, which is called The Return of Deaths. It's at the Circuit Courthouse in Houghton County, in Houghton, Michigan. And it actually lists every death certificate filed at that time in that township. And you can see that the death above number 1 is not related to the Italian Hall, and the death after 73 is not related. So 1 through 73 are the Italian Hall. That's it. 73 people died. He gets the facts wrong, but again, you got to be careful with facts because there are facts that we actually know about that are true. There's a kind of a complicated story I've got to tell you here, but at one point in time, the mine itself, the mines themselves actually raised money and tried to give the money as charity to the families of the victims of the Italian Hall. And they tried to give the money to the mine workers' families who refused to accept it because they were like, we're not going to take charity from them. Okay, and there's a famous statement where the guy from the union said, no, we'll bury our own dead. We don't need your charity. And so at one point in time, a group of people went to Charles Moyer's hotel room. And Charles Moyer was the head of the union. And they went to his hotel room and they threatened him and said, if you don't immediately denounce the statements that are attributing this cry of fire to possibly being somebody in league with the mines, bad things could happen to you. And he said, I can't do that. I wasn't there. I don't even know. I just want an investigation to be taken, to take place. And that group of people left, and another group of people quickly came back, and they beat him up, shot him, kidnapped him, threw him on a train, and said, if you ever come back here, we'll kill you. So that incident at the Scott Hotel with Charles Moyer was clearly intimidation, and it turned into kidnapping and assault and a bunch of other crimes. Mr. Wolf puts in his book on page 226 that the people went to Moyer's room in an attempt to give him money. They were trying to give him charity. And somehow that turned into, you won't take our money? Fine, we'll kidnap you. It doesn't even make any sense. But Wolf has adopted the position written by those who write the anti-worker histories. Some of the other things he gets wrong, the coroner was told to investigate this. He conducted an inquest. At the end of his inquest, he drew no conclusions. In fact, he failed to come to a conclusion as to whether or not these deaths were homicide, suicide, or accidental, which he was required to do by law. And Wolf says that the coroner ruled it a suffocation. Again, I offered to give Mr. Wolf the 73 death certificates because not on any one of them is any cause of death listed, let alone suffocation. I'm not even sure where he gets that from. I guess Mr. Wolf is making stuff up now. But the reason that's important for our discussion is I pointed out in my book that the coroner for the Italian Hall basically punted. He didn't even try to do his job. And the reason he didn't want to do his job is that he was on the side of mine management, and it would have made mine management look bad. So why do your job if it's going to make your masters look bad? And that, of course, is why you'd want to be correct on this and say the coroner didn't do his job, never mentioned anything about a cause of death, and simply went through the motions of pretending to do an investigation. So by saying that he actually did a proper investigation and found causes of death for 73, Wolf is actually, again, helping mine management spread, in essence, a lie. He mentions on page 217 that the grand jury brought no indictments in reference to the Italian Hall, and sadly for that, he cites me. And he's misciting me because I pointed out that the grand jury did indeed bring indictments. The grand jury that was seated in Houghton County during the strike actually brought indictments against Charles Moyer and the union. They never brought any indictments for the Italian Hall, but we don't even know if they investigated the Italian Hall because the grand jury was given a simple charge of investigate violence arising from the strike. And at the time of the Italian Hall disaster, not many people in local government considered the Italian Hall disaster to have been strike-related violence. They were still treating it like it was just a disaster or a calamity or something that just a big accident. And I don't know if anybody actually made the connection to where that, yes, this should be investigated as a crime tied to mine management. I don't know when that would have come up. But by suggesting that the grand jury brought no indictments, he's missing the fact that the grand jury, in fact, indicted the union members. So that shows you how crazy the world was up there. Again, though, he's taking the wrong side on this. He writes on page 229 that word spread quickly about the doors opening the wrong way. The Italian Hall disaster, for many years, people would argue with you and say the doors open inward, causing the disaster. That's never been the case, that the doors open the wrong way. The doors open the correct way. In fact, I found photographs showing the doors opening the correct way. But the weird part is that he puts in his book, word spread quickly that the doors opened the wrong way. When I was writing the second edition of my book, I decided to do some research, and I thought to myself, where did this story come from about the doors opening the wrong way? Because no one said it in 1913. It must have arisen later. And I did some research, and I found out later that it appeared in a book written in 1943 by a guy named C. Harry Benedict in a book called Red Metal. C. Harry Benedict was a Calumet and Hecla mine manager. He worked for mine management. I believe he was actually a metallurgist. And he wrote a book in which Calumet and Hecla looks really, really good. They're the big mine up there. And he says, by the way, the Italian Hall disaster happened. It's horrible. The doors opened the wrong way. And they blamed the disaster on the doors, because if you blame an inanimate object, you can't really get that mad. Or you blame it on the builder of the building or the architect, but it's certainly not the fault of the person who cried fire. But he says word spread quickly that the doors opened the wrong way. Number one, 30 years is not quickly. It took 30 years. And number two, he doesn't give a citation for that. And that's a problem. Because when you say something like word spread quickly, you should give us an example of how quickly the word spread. And it didn't spread quickly. So I was, again, aghast by these mistakes in his book. I pointed them out to him. He left them all in. I sent him a note actually recently saying I was kind of disappointed that he didn't make any of the changes. He said, well, I'm sorry to hear that. He didn't explain why he left all the mistakes in. But I can tell you that I went and saw him speak. He spoke in Michigan at a library not too far from me. And I went and sat in the audience, didn't identify myself. I just sat there. And he got up there and he talked, and he brought along a musician, and they played a couple songs. They played the songs mentioned in the book. And he at one point said, is anybody here familiar with the Italian Hall disaster? And I kept my hand down just because I wanted to see what would happen. And he said, oh, okay. And he didn't mention the Italian Hall until about the last 10 minutes of his presentation. And he mentioned it and kind of glossed over it and said, are there any questions? And somebody asked a question about the Italian Hall. And Mr. Wolf said, well, here's the problem with the Italian Hall. He said, a lot of these facts we don't know. There's a lot of confusion, a lot of arguments. He said, and this is the quote, we could argue all day long about whether or not there was a cry of fire. We could argue all day long about whether or not there was a cry of fire. I can tell you right now there was a cry of fire. I have a chapter in the second edition of my book called Why We Know There's a Cry of Fire. There was a cry of fire in the Italian Hall. There's no question about it. Questioning that would be like saying, I'm going to question whether or not the Titanic hit an iceberg. Maybe the Titanic hit something else. Maybe the Titanic never sank. We can argue and say stupid things all we want, but you've got to go look at the evidence and the facts and ask yourself what they show. There's no question there was a cry of fire at the Italian Hall. But worse, when Daniel Wolfe says that, we could argue all day long about whether or not there was a cry of fire at the Italian Hall. You've got to remember that Daniel Wolfe wrote the book, Grown Up Anger, The Connected Mysteries of Bob Dylan, Woody Guthrie, and the Calumet Massacre of 1913. This all goes back to the song Woody Guthrie wrote about the disaster. Okay? The song's called 1913 Massacre. And I published the song verbatim with permission of the Guthrie people. And I would call your attention to the beginning of the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth verse, where Woody Guthrie writes, the copper boss thugs stuck their heads in the door. One of them yelled and he screamed, there's a fire. There's a fire. That's in the song 1913 Massacre by Woody Guthrie. And that song, of course, is the thread that ties together Grown Up Anger by Daniel Wolfe. Woody Guthrie's not waffling on whether or not there's a cry of fire. Woody Guthrie is saying there was. Bob Dylan, when he sings the song and appears to endorse its contents, I guess, is also not waffling on whether there's a cry of fire. There was a cry of fire. And I've got a chapter in my book on it. And it's one of those things, I actually said to Mr. Wolf, if you want, I can send you the whole chapter. I wrote a whole chapter on this, whether there's a cry of fire or not. There was a cry of fire. You can't argue with that. There was a cry of fire. And so the fact that Guthrie adopts the position, there was a cry of fire, Dylan appears to also, but the author of the book on the song doesn't adopt it, I got a problem with that. So getting back to the original point, I want to make sure this is very, very clear. If you want to read Grown Up Anger, knock yourself out. But my point is, the book is well written, by the way, in terms of it reads well. Okay, if you don't know any of these facts and you just read it, it's entertaining. And some of the reviews in the back of the book are stellar. I wish I got reviews as good on all my books. The Wall Street Journal says Wolf blasts through layers of American history, a gripping account that reminds us of an important, if submerged, reality of American life. That's a damn good quote right there. Wall Street Journal's reviewed 2 of my books, but again, good reviews are good. But my point is, I believe that Wolf intended to tell the story of the tragedy in a way that accurately reflected the sufferings and wrongs done to the workers. But his failure to think critically or examine the major points in the narrative cuts through the purpose. It undercuts his purpose. And he actually does a disservice to those who died and their families, friends, and community. So, I've spent more than 10 years working in this field. I visited the Italian Hall disaster site 2 weeks ago. I walked the graveyard cemetery 2 weeks ago also. For those of you who watch my podcasts and videos, you might not have caught this. That's a block of wood from the Italian Hall. It's in the back of every single shot here. And the chair sitting next to me, like I said, is from the Italian Hall. I think about the Italian Hall a lot, and it bothers me when people write badly about it. So that's my review of Grown Up Anger. Again, if you want to, if you are interested in Woody Guthrie and Bob Dylan in particular, you might enjoy the book. But you got to be careful because the history involving the Italian Hall disaster is often wrong, and it's often spun in an anti-worker fashion, which is ironic and sad. So I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.